Let me, Mr. Etemadi, thank you for underscoring the importance of human rights being on the table when discussions of issues of nuclear weaponry are at hand. How do you trust a totalitarian regime on fissile material, on enrichment issues, on whether or not they have a bomb or plan on making bombs, is plural, not singular, when they so maltreat and torture and murder their own people, as well as 3 Americans who are being held unjustly? You know, Nakmeh Abedini testified at our hearing that we had here in December, and before that at a Frank Wolf hearing as part of the Lantos Commission. And at the Wolf hearing, shockingly, the administration told Nakmeh that there was, quote, nothing we can do to help her. Astounding. Thankfully, Secretary Kerry, when he heard that, did reverse course for the State Department, but frankly, it still is not part of the negotiating. It may be somewhere on the periphery, but far off the periphery, it would seem to me. Yesterday, I chaired a hearing on human rights in North Korea. We heard from Ambassador at Large from South Korea, the Republic of Korea, Ambassador Lee, who talked about a grand mobilization on behalf of the North Koreans who are being decimated by the newest Kim Jong-un, and talked about the gulags and really just laid out how horrific the mistreatment really is. Andrew Natsios, Special Envoy to Sudan, I should say, former USAID administrator and now co-chair of a North Korean human rights effort, talked about the abject failure of the nuclear talks and the delinking of human rights to those, and how human rights had grossly deteriorated because they were not even on the table, and people were not there for not subjected to relief that they might have gotten. The same issue being replayed with Iran. We've done it on trade issues with China. We're doing it on trade issues with Vietnam and many others. But the North Korea and the Iranian absolutely are appropriate parallels, and very, very discouraging that it is not there front and center. Again, how do you trust a regime that butchers its own people? I would say to Ms. Bahiri, in 1983, I joined President Reagan at the White House when they had a mobilization, and the President Reagan spoke out boldly how alarmed and dismayed we were at the persecution of Baha'i in Iran. And he talked about the 150 men and women who had been hanged or shot since Khomeini had come in. One of those was your dad, obviously. And my greatest sympathy, all of us on behalf of the committees, for your enormous loss. Not surprisingly, just like the Chinese, they made your family pay for the bullets that murdered your father. Again, underscoring why human rights have to be front and center and not on the peripheral negotiations, if they are that. So thank you for being here and bearing witness. Dr. George, on the CPC issue, which you spoke so eloquently to when you were here testifying before my subcommittee just a few weeks ago, I think members have to realize since 2011, not a single CPC designation. That is also a Frank Wolf legislation, the International Religious Freedom Act, called for annual designations. And frankly, like you said, wallpaper. If we don't have those designations and a robust enforcement, I mean, there are some 18 prescribed sanctions that were meant to be utilized when a country showed indifference or worse, doubled down and made things even worse. And you talked about how things have gotten worse under Rouhani. No, not even a designation since 2011. So I make a call again to President Obama. Designate CPC countries. Do it now, and as you have recommended, there are many more that ought to be added to the current list. Again, what you're just languishing, and there's been nothing done. We don't even have an ambassador at large. And I say to my colleagues, I chaired the hearings and marked up the bill for International Religious Freedom Act in this room back in 1998. This is not what we envisioned, a non-enforcement of that very important human rights piece of legislation. So, Dr. George, I'd like to ask you, you pointed out in your testimony that official policies promoting anti-Semitism have risen sharply in recent years, and Jews have been targeted on the basis of perceived ties to Israel. Could you elaborate on that? You point out the issue of sanctions. You know, I wrote the Belarus Democracy Act. We work very closely with the Europeans on who we sanction in the Lukashenko regime in Minsk. The numbers of people on both sides that are sanctioned, it's almost the same people, if not identical. You point out that the European Union has 90 people that have been sanctioned to R1, and you are encouraged that there's at least one, the mayor of Tehran. But where are the others? We have the law in place to do it. 90-1. If it was a World Cup score, it would be a blowout. We need to update and add to that list. You also, finally, I do have a lot of others, but I'll just go to your answers. Dr. George.
Yes, thank you, Congressman Smith. I'll take a moment to address the particular issues that you wanted me to talk about. We have noticed, our staff has noticed, that since Rouhani assumed the presidency, there has been a toning down of the anti-Jewish rhetoric that we had seen from government officials during the Ahmadinejad period. But what we haven't seen is any corresponding diminution of the pressure against the Jewish community, as still 20,000 Jews remaining in Iran, a fraction of what was once a flourishing and large community there. So yeah, there's been a toning down of the rhetoric, but no real action to make things any better, any different for the Jewish community. Like all the religious minority communities in Iran, they are third-class citizens or worse, and always subject to harassment of all sorts. So we don't have any good news to report beyond the rhetorical side for the Jewish community in Iran. Were you asking me particularly about the Jewish community in Iran? Because before your committee, of course, I talked about the rise of anti-Semitism globally.
Worse, but also about the sanctions regime and its
yes, we need those annual designations. We really do. You're right to urge the administration. We urge the administration to do that. We urge every administration, doesn't matter whether it's Republican or Democrat, to make those annual designations, to call attention to the offenses, and then to use those sanctions that are available under the Act, which was passed by Congress, signed into law in the 1990s by President Clinton. They are there to be used. They are effective tools when they are used. We saw this about a decade ago when the tools were used very effectively against Vietnam, when it was a very gross abuser of religious freedom. We saw some real benefits for persecuted religious people, Buddhists and Christians alike, in Vietnam. We then removed them from the CPC list to encourage the good behavior we had seen, to reward the progress that had been made. And unfortunately, they slipped right back into their old patterns of behavior and became an abuser again. And so we find ourselves in 2014 recommending that Vietnam, for example, again be shifted over to CPC status. That's another designation that we'd like to have made. But we need to follow the law here. We really need to make those designations. They need to be annual. We need to bring pressure on these regimes.
And again, on the sanctions enforcement with regards to the holding individual violators, like we've done with Belarus, Magnitsky Act, well, we have it now.
Exactly right. The tools are there in the legislation to put travel restrictions on people, officials who are responsible for the brutality and for the abuses, to freeze assets. Those tools are available as well. Make the people who are responsible for these human rights abuses, whether they're actually committing the abuses or whether they are tolerating them and letting them occur with impunity, make them pay a cost, make them suffer a cost. The tools are there right in the legislation. Let's use it.
Again, just before I yield back, Angel Natsios is one of the finest public servants I've known. Yesterday, as I said, he talked about North Korea and the abject failure of delinking human rights from the six-party talks. We have delinked human rights from the talks on nuclear issues vis-a-vis Iran. It is a mistake. My hope is it's never too late to relook at that. And I would encourage the administration, especially with the deadline coming up with the 3 Americans, but also on behalf of those Iranians who are suffering daily indignities and torture, to put human rights on the table and be bold about it, have names and lists. One of the things that Reagan did so excellently throughout his entire time when he was president, and Schultz when he was Secretary of State, wherever they went, especially the Soviet Union, before they met with Soviet officials, they met with the dissidents and they proffered a list that they gave to and said, we want progress on that because it's linked to everything else we do.
Would my colleague yield for just a question on that?
Sure.
Does my colleague agree that Because we just passed, as you know, the North Korean sanctions legislation. Does my colleague agree that there's a clear link between sanctions and the elevation of the issues he so eloquently has just described?
Oh, there's definitely a link.
I'm sorry?
Sanctions, I think, when they're judiciously applied effectively, and I think targeted sanctions are the best, and I think our witnesses have pointed that out. You know, we don't want to hurt the Iranian people. We stand with the oppressed, not the oppressor.
Yeah, I was just picking up on the North Korea thing.
Sure.
Yep. Thank you, thank you so much.
Thank you. And again, thank you. And